Okay, great. All right. All right. So I'll introduce Thulasy. I have known Thulasy for about 6 years, and Thulasy Lettner used to be the former equity coordinator at CommunityWise, leading the anti-racim organizational change project. And in my time of engaging with Thulasy and but like having her lead that project, I really got to learn so much about what it means to be a good facilitator, what it means to really bring people in relationship and build a community. I think for those of us who have been around, and by that I mean, I guess Lem, for example, who's come to very many meetings over the years of AROC really was a great and powerful time to build community with people doing the work of anti-racism and decolonization. And like many of us here and today, I think oftentimes that can get lost in the work of what that means to build community and build power and solidarity between each other. And Thulasy really helped, I think, for me, from what I was seeing, a great example of that, but also really leaned into that being such a powerful piece to the work that I really wanted to have her come in today to kind of talk a little bit about what that has meant or what that looks like. And so I'm really glad that Thulasy, you've been able to do that. And yeah, I guess, yeah, I'm just really happy to have you here. So I'm just curious for you a little bit more about yourself that you like to share, and then maybe we can just kind of get started with that kind of theme in mind.
Gotcha. Thank you, Tyson. And thanks all for inviting me here to be here. I wanted to acknowledge that I am not on Treaty 7 territory. I'm in Edmonton right now in Musqueam, which is the Cree word for Beaver Hills House or Edmonton. It's just Treaty 6 territory. And I moved here. I'm one of the many people that moved during the pandemic to be closer to family. So this is where I now call home. I worked at CommunityWise Resource Center for almost 5 years, coordinating AROC, and am now an independent consultant as of March for just over a year. I've been consulting in the world of racial equity or equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism work. And that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I identify as a Sri Lankan Tamil Canadian. I was born and raised here in Treaty 6 territory. My parents migrated from the Northern Peninsula, what is called Sri Lanka, in the late 70s. So I identify as a child of immigrants. I identify as a brown woman. I also identify as a non-Indigenous settler on these lands. So those are just some things to contextualize my perspective and my position in the work that we'll be talking about. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me. Where do you want to go next, Tyson?
Yeah, well, how about we speak a little bit to why I think that positionality that you just spoke to is super important, because I think that's something that when we were starting AROC, I never really even thought of or heard before people doing that. And I think one of the things that I often talk about when I've done facilitated sessions with folks is let's start there, because oftentimes, as we know, not everyone knows what that means and looks like for everybody, even though you may be working with them. And so I think, just curious, why do you think it's important, but also how did you find that being such a crucial part in the AROC process?
For sure.
Like a big question, but...
No, big question, but such a good question, because I feel like there's a story behind the practice of doing that really illustrates some of that community building, relationship building process that kind of is happening in the background. Like what you see at the end is a practice that we started using at AROC, where we would always start our meetings by describing to each other our ethno-racial identities. This became a regular practice. We would do it at the beginning of every meeting. Every time we reflected on this question, there was something new for us to think about. I feel like Tyson and I have talked about this practice of really deepening our self-awareness of our positionality, how we relate to this work, what it means, what does it look like for me to do this work? You know, like it looks different for me than it does for Tyson, and how we show up in space and just really deepening that awareness with each other. So that's what the practice was. But how did it come to be? It came to be because early on in the AROC process, probably like our first or second meeting, one of the participants, we would go around and do a check-in, and we would do our pronouns, and we would say maybe like how we're doing for the day. And one of the participants came up to me and said, look, we're talking about race and racism. Why are we not like talking about our racial identities in that introduction? And it was a moment for me as a facilitator of the process. I needed to be really open. I remember I needed to just be really open and have no ego in this process and just be like, listen to what's emerging and respond. That was like something that I just held as like a principle. Tyson said, I led this process. I always say I coordinated it. I was the person that was in that lucky, sometimes unlucky position of having to hear what people really felt about it. And for me, that was like the principle of relationality that I think that built so much of what came forward. So I had to hear that and not take it as a criticism of what we were doing, and just be like, invite that process. And I didn't know what that looked like. I'd never really talked about race, like our racial identity so explicitly, and kind of put people on the spot. And it's an uncomfortable and unsettling practice if you've never done it before. And I was like, but this is, yes, of course we need to do this. What you're saying is so true. So we just started this practice of going around. And anyway, so that's how the practice came to be. And then I think it brought people in to be able to share vulnerably with each other. And I think that that idea of like the process itself was going to be responsive to what they actually felt was also something that brought people in to the process. So that's, yeah, I don't know if you knew that, Tyson, but that was like kind of how it emerged early on.
Yeah, no, I didn't, but I definitely could feel that it was, for me anyway, and I can only speak my experience, that it was something that oftentimes repeating that, what that meant for me changed over that time. And also like, it's always kind of in flux based on like how I am being perceived in the world and how I want to sort of, what I want to put out there. Sort of my next thought would be like, how do you think this work, like how important is solidarity in this work when like trying to move anti-racism and decolonization efforts forward? Yeah,
solidarity, what a big word. This is how it became real for me. So what was interesting, and I'll just build on that last act, so that practice of self-identifying and telling like a nuanced story about our identity and have those layers being peeled back slowly together, allowed us to, it opened the door for us to do other interesting things like racial caucusing, where we would break into different groups based on our racial identities. And at first we split into two groups, which was like people who experience racism and people who do not experience racism, was sort of how we first split it up. So white non-racialized people and Black, Indigenous, and racialized people in two separate groups. And it set up this binary of like, we need to talk about our own experiences separately, process some of the emotionality behind talking and doing anti-racism work, talking about and doing anti-racism work, and then come together and go back and forth in this way. That was really helpful, I think, in terms of creating space for people to talk about what they needed to talk about. Over time, though, it creates a binary, a literal, black and white binary that is often leveled against, this is a criticism that's leveled against anti-racism work, that it creates division. And it doesn't actually bring people together. And I could sense that while we were doing this back and forth, I didn't think it was creating division, but it was definitely reinforcing a binary. And I don't think it was actually helping us build solidarity. And so I was talking through this with a mentor of mine in Toronto, and she said that, why don't you break into smaller groups? Get more granular in your racial experience. Why don't you have a Black group, an Indigenous group, racialized group, and a white group? And the reason why is you're breaking that binary apart. And now, like for myself, and I'll talk about my own experience, is that in the racialized group, person of color group, non-Black, non-Indigenous group, we could talk about our experiences of racism and also grapple with how anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity show up in our experiences in our lives. So we had to do a little bit of both. And that for me really like it made it more real. It made it like that positionality made it more nuanced and complex. And it wasn't so easy to just be binary, like this group is always right and we must always listen to them. And this group must always take a step back and listen, that binary that was emerging. And so when we broke into the separate caucuses, I felt that actually created more opening for us to be more nuanced in our understanding of our positionality and then our relationality with each other inside of that. So for me, that started building a sense of solidarity. And with that, again, rooted in my own experience, like I am a cis, straight, neurotypical, able-bodied person, even though I'm a racialized woman and I experience that intersection of the world under white supremacy and misogyny and the like. For me, that was also like an important thing for me to be like, who am I holding myself accountable to at any moment of this process, understanding that positionality and always turning, I kind of call it my, like an accountability compass. When you're doing this work and when emotions run high and there's like conflict or there's tension, that compass can like swing around, like whose experience am I supposed to attend to and center and kind of really honor in any given moment. And for me, it was really important that would land on if it would land on an experience that was different than my own, like how do I actually center that person's experience? How do I build enough trust and relationship with this person? And what does that even look like for them? Often it looks like hearing them out and responding in a credible way to what their concerns are, and then taking on that uncomfortable work and doing it. So that was like another form of like solidarity building for me as an individual, was sort of like always attending to that accountability compass, whose experience needs to be centered. I cannot be the spokesperson and representative of this thing that we're creating together, because it's about more than just me. Who do I bring forward? What does it look like for them? What does support look like for them? And how do we make that real in the world? So those are kind of like two practices that I would say kind of at a group level and then at an individual level that helped make solidarity like a real thing for me, like a real practice.
You know, I've said this quite a few times in like trainings of how people, when we respond, so like that solidarity, I think, in getting, and that racial caucusing, I think, developed over those periods of 5 years to a place where in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, and because I feel like because we had like a Black caucus, or that was like the idea of like what that was supposed to mean, that response in that moment from CommunityWise and from the AROC group, were able to actually respond better, not just because, a little bit of background, is that, there was some funding that came to CommunityWise, and I'd say, CommunityWise as an organization didn't necessarily, we don't do these things for Black individuals or Black communities, but because there was an element or part of the work of AROC, which was specifically trying to understand and support what that looked like, it was able to, the funds were able to actually go to something that was more meaningful because there was relationship. Versus, I think oftentimes, which I'm sure we may have all seen, as people like, making things up to sort of support the Black community or whatnot in those problems. And I felt like that was really such a great form of community of care that developed because it was being committed and responsible to the work. I'm wondering if there's any questions people have or any thoughts people are coming up with right now about like that sense of community that was developed. Go ahead, Laura.
It's such a relevant topic for me right now because I'm doing my it's a capstone project. I just finished doing like my 3 to 4, well, actually ended up being 6-page self-positioning statements, and it was pretty emotional for me to go through it, because just even as you're talking, like my identity and like so much just weird stuff like just marginalizes my experience, my family's experience, into places where like we wouldn't fit in a lot of those categories. For example, I was born in Brazil as well. I was born sou carioca. I was born in Brazil to Canadian parents. I've lived in Canada all my life. Since then, you know, my father told me my whole entire life that I had to choose when I turned 18 what nationality I was going to be. He told me I had to choose if I was going to be Canadian or Brazilian. So it was something that I thought about for a long time, which is, you know, sort of not part of the story. Anyways, I went back to Brazil, and my daughter, my oldest child, is also Brazilian, and she's a visible person of color. She's both Indigenous and African, and the whole mixing pot of what Brazilians are, you know. And so she's 22, and just like talking to her and relating to her on so many of these things, like I just feel like even though she's not here, I wish she was so she could share this. I just know that her experiences are so, she ends up feeling so marginalized in every single one of those groups. Like if she was in a situation like that, she would have no idea which place to sit in. Yeah, just because of all that. And then so I just wonder about other people who have those experiences, you know, because just in terms of like what that tension between identification and the strengths and the positive things that it can bring to people, as well as then like the tension between how that can be triggering and isolating and marginalizing to people too, in terms of like where are you, who are you, what do you know, what don't you know, like also too, my husband was adopted at birth. That he was adopted into an Indigenous family, but he's a white person, and you know, like it's just like strange identity states where you don't belong in any one of those. You know, like is there a place for those people too?
For sure, it's a really great question, and I'd say that the first thing I'll say is that the practice of doing that over and over again and really allowing people to tell those complex stories is like the first entry. It's the first door that allows us to really see people in like their wholeness instead of collapsing them into like neat categories. The storytelling aspect of it and that reflective aspect of it, even just you telling that story right now, I want to honor that stuff came up for you, right? And just telling that story to all of us. And that's what would happen every time we would do this. And now we know more about you. We know more we know what you're grappling with in the context of an anti-racism discussion. And so that's like lesson A for like that the practice itself allows us all to just contextualize, constantly reposition and contextualize and understand each other in new and deeper ways. The second practice of like actually then breaking into groups to talk to people with experiences that the way I set it up is to say like this, the purpose of this activity is to share your experiences with people that may also share them. So to talk about people with shared lived experiences within an anti-racism context. How do you experience racism? Which of these groups seems like you would have the best conversation because they are most likely to experience it in a similar way, not same, but similar way to you. Even within that, that's going to be complex. In our first time we did it, Tyson, that I facilitated it, this came up. 2 people, white passing Métis people, were called out by racialized people. And they said, you can't come into our caucus. You don't experience racism. In that moment, as a facilitator or as a holder of space, we have a choice to make. We decide to like stick to the rules. There's like, you experience racism or you don't experience racism, pick. And that will contribute to your ongoing marginalization of people. That's a replication of the behaviors that we're actually trying to dismantle. Mm-hmm. A rigidity in thinking about people and how they show up in the world and how they experience the world. In that moment, as a facilitator, again, having to just be super open to what's showing up in the space and not just collapse into something that's easy and neat and rigid. I invited a third space, and the purpose of the third space was for me to hear about these 2 individuals' experiences and what would it look like for them to be included in this? What structure would make the most sense for their experience? And so the 3 of us sat separately. The other 2 groups went off and talked, and they also had to grapple with what just happened, what just showed up in the space, right? Tyson, were you there? You were there. So you know what happened in that conversation.
I was
that was ended up being the point of the conversation. And I was there to hold space for these two individuals. And in the end, we discussed and we brought it all back together. And the conclusion was the experience of Indigenous people in Canada is one of ongoing systemic intergenerational trauma because of racism and white supremacy and colonialism. And so we needed to include them in the conversation about racism, even if they don't experience the type of racism based on skin color. It totally expanded our definition of racism and how people get racialized and what that even means beyond skin color and towards all the more complex ways that systemic racism impacts people's lives. So we expanded the definition. I created like a guideline that was like, why are we including, what does it mean? Where do you go? Like if you experience different things. And then that ended up being refined over time. And then we never really had that issue again, where people didn't feel like they didn't have a place to go. And I think that just comes down to like responsive facilitation, then that choice to like dig in and be like, this is the way it has to be. I know, Tyson, what was your experience of that moment?
I was gonna say a comment to that. I think, and for all of us here, is like, I think that there's always work to be done, and I don't even know why we were. I mean, we talk about what racial caucusing is, but there was an initial reason why we split up into groups, right? It was to respond to something that was already prior, whatever, right? And yet, what ended up happening was, let's take time to hold space to actually understand this impact in community with each other than it was to, identify how people are, whatever it was, right?
Whatever the initial
it was like, let's actually take time and to understand what that means. And I think that for me was really important, because this work is really hard and it is really difficult. And Laura, to everything that you mentioned, it can feel really messy and hard to untangle. And yet so oftentimes we get put into the boxes already so quickly that you have to have time to undo that and really sit with all of those things, especially as grief and things come up, which I think is so powerful when you can do that in community and in response. And in the same way, within a Black caucus, we can talk about colorism, we can talk about certain things that that has its own marginalization to it. But also, I think in like the sanctity almost of the people who most are impacted by it. Like there are some things that I would feel like are really important to be able to share, but maybe not share with white people listening in per se, or like these other areas that are to be talked about within sort of more of that community of people who experience certain things. And so I think that's also just a really important piece.
Yeah, I think like I totally get like the power of identity in terms of like being in a place where you don't have to explain yourself. Everyone gets you. You know that, and it's just I guess it's just a comment on how complex the like identities are in terms of like where they show up all over the place,
And I think that what's interesting about anti-racism work, one of the main frustrations for people who experience racism is that denial that it exists, and then so that's why it's so important to have a space to talk about it.
Yeah.
And just get it out there and get some validation about what you're experiencing. And then it doesn't end there. I've noticed, I don't know, Tyson, if you would agree, and Lemlem, I know you've done some caucusing too, like what happens once that gets out there, it's like people can then create some distance between themselves and this racial identity that's being put on them, right? They can actually create some distance versus like having it be something that they need to hold on super tightly because like everyone is denying their experience. And so interestingly, by like putting a hyper focus on it, it creates that ability to create some distance and be like, you know what? I am a brown woman and I am so much more than that. I am so much more than that. That is just one part of my experience because I live under conditions of white supremacy and it's good to talk about it, but also I am so much more than that. And I think that without the caucusing process or having some sort of affinity group or peer support around that, I think it could go the other way.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's not the end. It's not the end. It's like creating these neat boxes is not the end, but it's like this necessary in-between step before we can get to something beyond race.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's sort of like I see like in like avatars. you know, like there's this avatar experience everyone has within the shared collective, social collective. And by acknowledging them and seeing, okay, well, this group of avatars is having this experience. It's not happening. This is totally happening. And then being able to pull that out in terms of social experience and social construction, and being able to then have more power because you have that the attachment and detachment. Like you can come in
Exactly.
open. Yeah. Interesting.
Does anyone else have any questions or any thoughts or comments?
Lem.
Yeah.
So good to see you.
Yeah, nice to see everybody. Yeah, with our anti-racism unlearning and learning series, we had similar things. And for me, particularly, there's a few things that came to my mind right away. Is there's a sense of like when I identify myself, there's a sense of reclaiming also of the constant always being asked like where you're from, right? That's always, right? Like, so I feel I feel like it's just a different way of like situating myself and reclaiming that. And the second thing was where our learning series, our white friends from our group, it also deconstructed their own identity of like, I'm just Canadian. And that's it. That's the end. Like, I'm like the regular Canadian. So that we took that deeper and unpeeled the layers of what that means. Um, and and I think that was really a good dialogue that led us to a lot of other discovery of each other, um, uh, 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 of who we are. And then the third is like in many cultures, it's a protocol actually to really identify who you are. And I used to just, when I was younger, I used to just hate it because like an elder person would come in like, whose child are you? And then like, and I'm like, you wouldn't know me. And then they, like, they would say, no, who's your parent? Who's like, like, then they find a connection. The older people would find a connection, and then they see who you are. And of course, as a young person, you was like, oh my God, like, why is this person asking me? But I appreciate now, and I answer those questions really respectfully. I haven't taken that practice myself because I don't know much. But I think also there's like a protocol of really bringing yourself, your whole self, and knowing yourself when you introduce like that. And it's also reminding, for me, it reminds me that I'm a guest here in 3 to 7 or in any, and wherever I go in this and Turtle Island, to respect and be a good guest and a good neighbor, right?
Thanks, Mom. Anyone else and that wants to have a comment? Question? Go ahead, Sinara.
I think this is a question maybe for all of you. I don't know. I'm new to Canada. I've been here just for 2 years, and I'm still learning how this EDIA work started so strongly after George Floyd murder. And I've listened more than once that some people are saying that like there was this big wave with George Floyd murder into those type of discussions, and some of people feel that those discussions are, going down a little bit, and people are not sure how to, what this work will mean from now on. I was wondering if you have like this feeling that these discussions are going down or no, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely have some thoughts on that. I'll tell you how I experienced like 2020, and then I want to know how Tyson experienced it too. But just related to what you were saying, like we had just spent 4 years at that point, building like this foundation of community and relationality and accountability at the sort of community level, doing these practices, working with each other, caucusing, sort of under the radar, like just kind of holding true to principles, getting the funding that would allow us to do that, saying no to the funding that wouldn't allow us to do that. So we were kind of doing this thing. It was happening in the context of I remember it started around Donald Trump's presidency, and this was when racism was out in the open. So we were no longer in denial collectively because he was deploying racism as a strategy in his campaign and everything. And so it was no longer like this like thing that I needed to convince people of, but that we now had to get to work on. So it was happening in that context, but still it wasn't really being taken as seriously as it was in 2020. When 2020 happened, like Tyson said, we had like this strong structure and foundation and these relationships that we could then respond to what was happening in a way that was equitable and that was anti-racist. It was like we were preparing and cultivating the ground for when this moment happened, we could respond. And it wasn't just responding internally at CommunityWise or responding to each other, but like, I think there were people throughout AROC that were called into other spaces to support the work that was now happening at the city of Calgary, at the province of Alberta, like all of these like institutional structures that they were like not really paying attention to what we were doing, right? Like for 5 years. And then now they're like, who's doing anti-racism work? Where is the capacity? Who knows how to do this? And we had been doing it, and we were cultivating that capacity in the community for so long. So for me, there's like this theory of change that emerged for me that was around like the process, the importance of community building. It never goes away. It's a constant ongoing practice. And then there's these moments where then it'll become clear that it's there, like the light will be shone on it, and that we'll be called into these moments to like help. Now, is the purpose to actually change those institutions or to like, hope that now that's how the change is going to happen? For me, it's like, I'm like kind of ambivalent about that. I'm kind of ambivalent about that because it's the community work that matters the most anyway. It sets everything else up into different possibilities. And so for me, and kind of, I've been considering my own work. Do I want to go into those halls of power and start like saying, now that you're paying attention, this is what you need to do? Maybe a little bit, but I think more importantly, it's just to double down on that community building, because I can see now how important it is, not just intrinsically to each other in the moment, but like extrinsically as soon as these big things happen in the world, and that change things for people. So I don't know if that answers your question, but for me, it was like, it's part of this longer arc, I think, and not even an arc. I don't like the idea of an arc that like kind of bends towards justice. I don't know if I agree. I see it as like these waves or like these sort of like very complex movements that are happening, and building community is at the core of it. Tyson, how about you? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like that's like, I mean, we could keep unpacking. Like for me, it's like that moment of like political discourse or like or what the impact is, like Trayvon, like in my lifetime, like Trayvon Martin, for example, where it's like, oh wow, like this is like what the heck. And yet and that was 2009, like and prior to that it was like Obama and like all his blackness being sort of taken apart. And so like that's sort of my like entry, I guess, or like I thought of like, how is all of this entwined with who I am and my identity and like what that means. And so, and you keep taking that back. And so I do feel like I guess like the waves of it looks different. And I think as holding into that way you say like the practice of community building around anti-racism and decolonization, I think is integral and important. But what I think is more somewhat often more like insidious that we don't necessarily talk about is the increase of white supremacy in these places that are just like pushing those things, like they're mobilizing as well, almost in a very, I think, different way than maybe what I would say maybe like, or at least 10 years ago, or what I mean. So I think that for me is something that is very, what makes this work also so important is that it is pushing back very much so against this and the work that everyone here is doing in different ways against, I think, this real mobilization around that. And I'm curious, yeah, any other questions? And there's something too that I was curious to kind of, like, this word like liberation keeps coming up as well for me the last couple of weeks, about like what that has meant in this work. And I'm curious also if you have any like thoughts about like that relationship piece. But yeah, I'm curious also to know what other people are maybe thinking right now.
I just wanted to say, like, in response to your question, Sayonara, of like, was there a peak and is it dipping? Like, yes. And that is very much like how things go here and in this place. And like the attention people have and commitment people have is so limited. And like pre 2020, there was like a big surge in interest in Calgary around reconciliation. And what does that mean? And a lot of conversations happening around that. And then George Floyd happened and the Black Lives Matters movement resurged, and attention was rightfully placed there. But there was also like a sharp decline in like, oh, okay, reconciliation was the thing of the past, and now we're focusing on this. And then last year, I think we are around the year anniversary of the 215 graves found, that like led to a new resurgence of that. And like, in terms of like your question, in terms of like Canadian culture and how that works, like 100% attention spans from the vast majority of society are very limited. And it is very much triggered by like, what's the event of the day? And like, how long can like mass culture's attention be kept to that? But I also think that that's like why what Thulasy and Tyson are describing is so important, is like building that into the fabric of community and how we engage with people. And like for us to, in the platforms that we have in community spaces, to bring in these practices, to start to normalize those conversations and to keep them central, because media is not going to keep paying attention, because everyday organizations aren't going to take attention, because the CEOs and executive directors and board of directors of the nonprofits that we all work for are not going to keep paying attention. They're going to throw it into a grant application when it makes sense, but they're not going to do the hard work. They're not going to transfer the power of the resources unless we put that pressure. So like, it's a very Canadian thing to be like, yes, we care about this, and we'll like put some attention for a little period, but it will also wane. So to Thulasy's point, like the point, like the community part of it's the point anyway. So like, let's take it, like, let's just keep doing that and put that importance on it, and be ready when something does happen and that attention's there to be able to answer it in a meaningful way, but also know that like that attention's going to wane, and it'll be the next crisis will then be, okay, like now our focus is on this. And that's like very much the nature of life here, unfortunately, because white supremacy has very deep roots and is very pervasive.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump off of that to say something about Tyson's question around liberation, another big like word, because like institutional power will arrange itself around the comfort of those that have power. So, you know, I'm thinking of white supremacy culture, the tool, and the right to comfort section of that tool. The right to comfort, and I always use that to kind of make sense of what's happening. And so it's very easy to go from let's talk about anti-Black racism to let's talk about EDIA, which is like a slide of comfort, right? I don't want anti-Blackness is way too uncomfortable for me to deal with, but I could talk about, you know, everyone. How can everyone be included? You know, like that is a slide of comfort. And so that, you know, as Amanda and Tyson were both saying, this is what happens here. And under conditions of white supremacy culture and colonialism, as we have it now. So what does it mean for us to seek liberation inside of such conditions? I think there is like two parts that need to have, I don't know, it's like, if I were to simplify it, it is important for us to do the community building work, to like build our own capacity, to build our relationships and accountability, to go into those halls of power and demand, like make demands of them in a way that doesn't arrange around their comfort. One of the things I'm grateful about is that the years of organizing work in the States that led up, that happened in advance of George Floyd, was that the word abolition. is now in like a mainstream, is being used in a mainstream way that I don't think we can't go back from that now. The idea of police and prison abolition is now out there, whereas before it was like a radical idea. So I think inside our communities, if we can like keep our work looking into that horizon of what's possible, and what liberation actually means, like Indigenous sovereignty and land back, reparations, like all of these things that people kind of like, ooh, that's getting like kind of intense and like radical. But we need to like, if we can build a community capacity around that and organize around those sorts of things, I think there is a way that it translates eventually into these bigger powers, these bigger systems of power that we can then, call for change in. But I think for me, it's like to build other locations of power. I've said this many times over, is just that like, I'm not going to spend all of my time and all of my energy really sort of appealing to whiteness. That like constantly sort of like making things more gentle, soft, holding the hand of these, like walking them through it, giving them all the different, like, Tyson and I have worked on, we're just trying to like really break it down and give them what they need to do, and then still getting met with like, well, I don't really know what to do. I don't know how to do it. Like, can you tell me more? Like, it's like, this is like, I can't spend all my time doing that. That's like a one-way route to not liberation. That makes me feel like white supremacy and colonialism are sort of totalitarian. I kind of describe this sometimes, like it's like everything, there's like no room for freedom inside of that. But there is, we cannot let ourselves be beholden to these systems in that way. Yes, materially, they impact people's lives. And yes, it's like life and death. People lose their lives because of these things. I don't want to diminish that in any way. But like Adrienne Marie Brown, was I just listening to a podcast with her about in which she was talking about science fiction, and how she said many times that like the work of community organizing is an act of science fiction, because we're trying to bring a future into being. We're trying to imagine a future. And she said, sometime in the past, there was this idea or this imagination around white supremacy. It was an idea, it's a social construction, right? And it came into being. And so like, how are we going to imagine, new ways of being in the world, and how can we practice that in community with each other? For me, having my mind be like, to find liberation in this moment right now for me is to make sure that I have space in my life to imagine and practice that, and that there is like, I can do that. We can create communities around that. I think AROC was such a community where we were like, let's just put this into practice here with each other, and create a different location of power, regardless of what's happening, not denying or dismissing or diminishing what's happening, and the impacts of those, but let's do something different, because we have to. Like, that's for me like an act of liberation in the here and now. That's really important for me.
Thank you, Thulasy. We have had you a bit longer than I mentioned that I told you would, but we started a little bit later. So thank you for coming in. And I think the work that we're doing in this space is, as been mentioned and we are aware of, is that it does take, it's fraught with a lot of resistance, not from inside the group, but from outside the group, and what that means to for us in our organizations, to think about. I think for me, hopefully, and my intention to bring you in is not only because of all of the wonderful things that you have to say and of grounding us, but also for us to lean into the sense of like of community and practicing how we really want to be able to treat each other, and for me to and how Amanda and I can hold space for us to also tackle with some of these really big, not just our commitments, but also to the ways in which as a space for safety as well. And so thank you so much for, there's so many great things you said, especially at the end, like that idea and capacity to also have a different future and practice it. And so thank you so much for sharing all that you do and coming in and speaking to us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. When Tyson invited me, he said it would be like more of a fun conversation, more fun than the ones we typically have. with people about anti-racism. And it's true. So thank you for that. It's always so great to be in conversation with Tyson. Tyson, I mean, you were a part of AROC before I was. I feel like you, and after I left. So I think that like you're as much a part of that as I ever was, if not more. So thank you for all of your work and contributions to the process over the years. Yeah, and thank you all for listening. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and contributions. Thanks so much. It's so great to see some of you again and to meet some of you for the first time. I hope our paths cross again in the future. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you, Thulasy.
Would it be all right to drop off, or is there? Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Great.
No worries.
Thanks. If anyone wants to be in touch, Tyson can connect us.
Yeah, for sure.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, Thulasy.